Alabama gives landlords broad freedom to set and raise rent, consistent with the state's overall landlord-friendly regulatory approach. The governing law is found in the Alabama Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Alabama Code Title 35, Chapter 9A, and while it establishes procedural requirements for the landlord-tenant relationship, it places no restrictions on the amount a landlord can charge for rent. Alabama does not have rent control or rent stabilization of any kind. There is no state statute that caps rent increases, limits the frequency of increases, or requires landlords to obtain government approval before raising rent. Alabama's political and regulatory environment strongly favors property rights and market-based pricing, and rent control has never been part of the state's legislative conversation. Alabama has not enacted a specific preemption statute prohibiting local rent control, but no Alabama municipality has enacted or seriously considered local rent restrictions. Birmingham, Montgomery, Huntsville, Mobile, Tuscaloosa, and every other Alabama community operate under the same market-based framework. Given the state's political climate and generally affordable housing market, local rent control is not a realistic possibility in the foreseeable future. For month-to-month tenancies, the landlord must provide advance written notice before a rent increase takes effect. Alabama requires at least 30 days written notice before changes to the terms of a monthly tenancy. Under the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, the landlord must deliver notice at least 30 days before the next periodic rental date. So if rent is due on the 1st and you want the increase to take effect on May 1st, you need to deliver the notice by April 1st at the latest. The notice should be in writing and should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the effective date. Alabama doesn't prescribe a specific statutory form for rent increase notices, but a clear written notice delivered by a documented method, personal delivery, leaving a copy at the tenant's residence, or sending by mail, is always recommended. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term unless the lease includes a provision allowing mid-term increases. Common mid-term adjustment provisions include escalation clauses, provisions tied to property tax changes, and CPI-based formulas. Without such a provision, the landlord must wait until the lease expires to negotiate a new rent as part of a renewal or new lease. When a fixed-term lease approaches expiration, the landlord should communicate the proposed new rent well in advance. If the tenant agrees, a new lease or renewal is executed at the new rate. If the tenant doesn't agree, the lease expires at its natural end. If the tenant stays and the landlord accepts rent, the tenancy converts to a month-to-month arrangement subject to the 30-day notice requirement for future changes. For week-to-week tenancies, the notice period for rent changes is 7 days, matching the one rental period standard. Now let's cover the restrictions that apply even without rent control. Rent increases cannot be retaliatory. Alabama has a specific anti-retaliation provision under Section 35-9A-501 that prohibits landlords from taking adverse action, including raising rent, in retaliation for a tenant exercising their legal rights. Protected activities include making a good faith complaint about habitability to a government agency, complaining to the landlord about conditions that violate the rental agreement or applicable codes, exercising any right under the Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, and participating in a tenants organization. Alabama's anti-retaliation provision doesn't specify a fixed presumption period with the same precision as some states, but courts evaluate the timing and circumstances of the rent increase relative to the tenant's protected activity. A significant rent increase shortly after a tenant files a code enforcement complaint, particularly when other comparable units aren't receiving similar increases, creates a strong inference of retaliatory intent. The landlord would need to demonstrate that the increase was motivated by legitimate business factors, market conditions, operating cost changes, or property improvements, rather than by the tenant's complaint. If a court finds that a rent increase was retaliatory, the tenant can recover damages and attorney's fees. The finding can also undermine the landlord's credibility in any related legal proceedings. The safest approach is to document the business justification for every increase and apply increases consistently across comparable units. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and Alabama's own fair housing provisions, including those administered through the Alabama Center for Real Estate and the Alabama Human Rights Commission, landlords cannot raise rent based on a tenant's race, color, religion, national origin, sex, disability, or familial status. Alabama's fair housing protections align closely with the Federal Fair Housing Act. A discriminatory rent increase can be established through evidence of disparate treatment, raising rent for tenants of one racial or ethnic background while keeping rates stable for comparable tenants of a different background, implementing larger increases for families with children, or targeting tenants with disabilities. The pattern of conduct creates the evidentiary basis for a complaint, even without direct evidence of discriminatory intent. The best protection is consistency and documentation. Apply the same criteria for increases across all comparable units. Document the market data and operating cost changes that support your pricing decisions, and keep records showing that increases are applied uniformly regardless of tenant characteristics. From a practical standpoint, Alabama's rental market has been one of the most dynamic in the Southeast in recent years, and the story is largely about Huntsville. Huntsville has emerged as one of the fastest-growing cities in the South, driven by an extraordinary concentration of aerospace, defense, and technology employment. Redstone Arsenal, home to NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, the Army's Space and Missile Defense Command, and the FBI's Operational Technology Division, anchors an economy that has attracted billions of dollars in investment and tens of thousands of high-paying jobs. The Mazda-Toyota manufacturing plant has added further economic diversification. Huntsville's rental market has tightened dramatically as the population has surged. Rents have increased substantially, and landlords in Huntsville generally have strong pricing power, particularly in desirable areas like downtown, the villages of Providence, Hampton Cove, and communities near the Arsenal. The market supports regular annual increases, and demand has remained strong despite the price growth. Birmingham, Alabama's largest metro area, has a more moderate rental market driven by healthcare, including the UAB Medical Center, one of the state's largest employers, financial services, engineering, and a revitalizing urban core. Birmingham's rental market varies significantly by neighborhood. Downtown, Lakeview, Avondale, and the Highland Park area have seen revitalization and strong demand. The Mountain Brook and Homewood suburbs command premium rents. Other parts of the metro area are more affordable, with more moderate pricing power. Birmingham has also been the center of Alabama's housing affordability conversation. While the city hasn't enacted any rent regulation, and the state's political environment makes such regulation unlikely, tenant advocacy organizations in Birmingham have been increasingly active. Landlords should be aware of the local conversation, even as they operate within the market-based framework. Montgomery, the state capital, has a stable rental market driven by state government, Maxwell Air Force Base, healthcare, and Hyundai's manufacturing presence. Military tenants' housing budgets are tied to BAH rates, and landlords near Maxwell should monitor annual BAH adjustments when planning increases. The broader Montgomery market is affordable and offers moderate pricing power. Mobile, Alabama's port city on the Gulf Coast, has a rental market influenced by the port, Airbus's manufacturing facility, shipbuilding, healthcare, and the University of South Alabama. Mobile's market is moderate and has seen growth tied to the aerospace and maritime industries. The Gulf Coast location brings hurricane risk that can temporarily affect the rental market, as we discussed in our lease termination video. Tuscaloosa, home to the University of Alabama, has a tight student-driven rental market. The university's large enrollment and the intensity of college football culture in Tuscaloosa create strong and consistent demand. Rents near campus are high relative to the city's size, and rent adjustments in the student market typically occur at the beginning of each academic year. Game day weekends generate additional short-term demand that has spawned a secondary market for event-related rentals. Auburn and Opelika, home to Auburn University, have a similar student-driven dynamic. The university's growth has expanded rental demand, and the broader Lee County area has seen development driven by both the university and proximity to the Kia manufacturing plant in West Point, Georgia. Florence, Muscle Shoals, Sheffield, and Tuscumbia, the Shoals area, have a moderate market influenced by the University of North Alabama and regional manufacturing. Dothan, near Fort Novosel, formerly Fort Rucker, has a military-influenced market where BAH rates drive pricing for a significant portion of tenants. Anniston, near the Anniston Army Depot, has a smaller military-influenced market. Gadsden, Decatur, and other mid-size Alabama cities have moderate to soft markets with limited pricing power. Rural Alabama, particularly the Black Belt region in the central and western parts of the state, has the softest rental markets. Population decline, limited economic opportunity, and low incomes constrain demand and pricing power. Landlords in these areas need to be very conservative about increases and focus on maintaining occupancy. One best practice for Alabama landlords: tailor your rent increase strategy to the specific market dynamics of your location. In Huntsville's booming market, annual increases of 5 to 8% may be well absorbed. In Birmingham's moderate market, 3 to 5% is more typical. In softer markets like rural Alabama or smaller cities, even modest increases need to be evaluated against the risk of vacancy. Understanding your specific market, not just the statewide trends, is the foundation of good pricing decisions. Another best practice, for landlords in university towns like Tuscaloosa and Auburn, understand the student housing competitive landscape. Purpose-built student apartments with modern amenities, resort-style pools, and proximity to campus have become the standard for student housing at major universities. If your properties compete in the student market, your pricing must reflect what students are willing to pay relative to these alternatives. The student market turns over annually, giving you a natural opportunity to adjust rent, but competition is intense and overpricing leads to vacancies. Alabama's climate creates practical considerations that can affect rent increase decisions. The state's hot and humid summers mean that air conditioning costs are substantial, whether borne by the landlord or the tenant. If you include utilities in the rent, rising electricity costs are a legitimate business justification for rent adjustments. If tenants pay their own utilities, a large rent increase on top of high summer cooling costs can push the total housing burden beyond what tenants can absorb. The Gulf Coast's hurricane risk, affecting Mobile and the Baldwin County beach communities, creates an additional practical consideration. Natural disasters can temporarily disrupt the rental market, damage properties, and affect demand. Landlords in hurricane-prone areas should maintain adequate insurance, build financial reserves, and factor potential disruptions into their long-term pricing strategy. For landlords near military installations, Redstone Arsenal, Maxwell Air Force Base, Fort Novosel, and Anniston Army Depot, understanding BAH rates is essential. The military population represents a reliable and financially stable tenant base. Pricing at or near the BAH rate for your area keeps your property competitive for military tenants. BAH rates are adjusted annually, typically announced in December and effective in January, and your pricing strategy should align with these changes. Alabama also has growing manufactured home communities, particularly in rural areas and smaller cities. Landlords who own or manage these communities should be aware of any specific notice or procedural requirements that may apply to lot rent increases under Alabama law. For Alabama landlords who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, rent increases must be approved by the local housing authority. The authority evaluates whether the proposed rent is reasonable by comparing it to comparable unassisted units. Submit increase requests well in advance of the desired effective date. Alabama requires landlords to return the security deposit within 60 days of the tenant vacating, one of the longer return periods in the country. Alabama limits the security deposit to 1 month's rent. If the landlord fails to return the deposit within 60 days, they may be liable for double the amount wrongfully withheld, plus attorney's fees. While these rules don't directly regulate rent increases, landlords should understand that increasing rent doesn't automatically entitle them to collect additional deposit from an existing tenant. The 1-month cap is based on the current rent, so a rent increase does raise the theoretical maximum deposit, but collecting additional deposit would require a new agreement with the tenant. For the complete guide to Alabama rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our landlord-tenant law series.